sideline of me. It's only a small portion of my responsibilities, which are to cover all of southeastern Mass, which is Barnstable, Bristol, Plymouth, Dukes, and Nantucket counties. I started in 1990 as the Southeast District Fisheries Manager. I grew up in Hingham, and now I actually stock the stream that I grew up in, the town, the Weir River in Hingham, so I get to stock that river now. But I became interested in brook trout and became a fisheries biologist because I used to fish for brook trout up in the small streams in New Hampshire near the Ammonoosuc River in Bath, New Hampshire. So that's how I got interested in brook trout. When I came down here, there was some talk about sea-run brook trout, and at that point, they were so rare, it was almost like a unicorn to me. It's like, did they even exist? And so the more and more I learned about it, the more and more real they became. And I'm going to talk tonight about some of the successes we've had in restoring sea-run brook trout to southeastern Mass and Cape Cod. If I can get this thing to work. Technology doesn't always work. I'll use it the old-fashioned way here. Let's see. So the brook trout, the native range of the brook trout extends from Canada all the way down along the Appalachian Mountains to about Georgia. Here in Massachusetts, we're very near to the southern extent of their coastal range, though. Right here, I'm going to be talking mostly about the sea-run brook trout in southeastern Mass and Cape Cod. Originally, brook trout ranged down the coast as far as Long Island. And there's still a very tiny population of wild brook trout down on Long Island. But the thing to remember about brook trout is they're not even really a trout. They're actually a char. The proper name of the brook trout is actually the brook char. And if you look through the Canadian literature, they actually get it right. The brook char, Salvelinus fontinalis. And the critical thing about brook trout is they're a cold water species. If you have temperatures more than about 70 degrees Fahrenheit for extended periods of time, you won't have brook trout. And the preferred temperature is actually about 52 to 56 degrees, which actually happens to correlate with the groundwater temperature in Cape Cod and Plymouth County. And so brook trout generally, a lot of people think that brook trout generally eat invertebrates like this caddisfly, but oftentimes they can eat larger fish, like small fish like the herring. This was a fish taken from the Charles River. It had actually a mummy chug in it. That picture there, it's not the clearest picture, but that was an eel that was coughed up by a brook trout. So brook trout will eat fish if they have the opportunity. In terms of their life cycle, basically after they hatch out, generally in late January and February in this area, you often see them at the shallows, the margins of the streams in these little backwater areas. And these are some pictures I've taken at the Mashpee River and Red Brook, two of the streams that I'll be talking about. And oftentimes at this time of year, if you look in the very shallows, you can see these small brook trout. Generally in Massachusetts, the average growth rate, based on the literature, is at age 1, they're about 3 inches long, age 2, about 6 inches long, and age 3, they're about 9 inches long. And that's about the lifespan of a brook trout in Massachusetts. Up in Canada, they can grow to a larger size and they live a lot longer. But here in Massachusetts, we're near the southern end of their range, and they basically burn themselves up metabolically. So a 9-inch fish is typically a big brook trout for Massachusetts. You can only really tell the sex of a brook trout during the spawning season. They're very difficult to tell a male and female apart, except when they're mature and during the spawning season. We have a female here which has more of a streamlined shape. Sometimes you can actually see the belly, which holds all the eggs. Whereas the male gets more of a deeper body. Sometimes they get real brightly colored on the belly, and they develop a hooked jaw. But for the most part, you really can't tell what sex the brook trout is when they're small. So in this area, the brook trout seek out upwelling groundwater in order to lay their eggs. And they specifically key in on these areas of groundwater. And generally, in this area, it's about 52, 53 degrees Fahrenheit. And they'll sweep out the red with their tails and deposit their eggs. The eggs are basically buried in the sand and gravel over the winter, bathed in that groundwater, which is a fairly steady temperature. And they usually hatch out in late January or February. The original native inhabitants of Massachusetts did know about sea-run brook trout. And We base this on one of the oldest legends on Cape Cod. Is about the formation of the Santuit River, which is one of these glacially formed streams on Cape Cod. And it's a fairly narrow river valley, and according to the native Wampanoag legend, it was a great trout heard the Wampanoag maiden singing up near Santuit Pond, and this great trout forced its way out of the sea and carved the Santuit River Valley. Of course, nowadays we know it was a glacial outwash plain, and these were meltwaters that formed these rivers. But this did indicate that the Native Americans knew that there were trout that actually inhabited the salt water. And this is a picture of a salter brook trout by Steve Angers that was taken from Red Brook. It shows that streamlined shape with some of this silvery coloration on it. And the sea-run brook trout are locally known as salters, and they're the anatomous form of the brook trout. It's a life history variant, and as far as we know, there's no real genetic component that people have been able to prove. There's some indications there might be some genetic component up in Canada, but down here there doesn't seem to be really any genetic component. It's just some of the brook trout do happen to go down into the ocean. Historically, they were known as either sea-run brook trout. The Canadians call them sea-run brook char. In the early literature, they just called them sea trout. So if you go back in the 1800s literature, they talk about sea trout. And these were actually sea-run brook trout. And the thing that's appealing about these sea-run brook trout is they grow to a much larger size than our typical wild brook trout in Massachusetts. This is a fish that was taken in Red Brook, almost 15 inches long. And typically, when they first come up from the salt water, they get this silvery sheen like a salmon. But that silvery sheen is only there for a couple of weeks based on some studies they did back in the 1950s. So you'd be very, very rare to catch a silvery salter unless it just comes right up from the ocean. People always thought the way to tell a salter was the large size. Anything over 12 inches long was thought to be a sea-run brook trout in these streams. But I'll talk a little bit later about some of the things that we're finding out. If you go back in the literature, some of the earliest literature in fishing in Massachusetts was the diary of John Roe. If anybody's ever been to Boston, they know Roe's Wharf. It's one of the landmarks of Boston that was actually named after John Roe. He was actually an owner of one of the Boston Tea Party ships. So he was a very well-to-do merchant, and he could actually spend money importing the best fishing tackle from England. And he used to travel down from Boston to fish a river called the Monument River. And in May 24th of 1770, before the American Revolution, he reported catching 10 trout about the 18 inches from the Monument River. Unfortunately, the Monument River no longer exists. It's now known as the Cape Cod Canal. But in the 1770s, it was a great sea-run brook trout stream. Another famous person that if you go back in the literature was Daniel Webster. He would specifically travel down to Cape Cod to fish for sea-run brook trout and salter trout. And Daniel Webster is well known as a statesman and orator, and one of his most famous addresses was at the Bunker Hill Monument dedication in 1825, where he addressed over 100,000 people, which was basically almost the entire population of Boston probably at that time. And he starts it out with, "O venerable men," is how he started the oration. And according to his diary, the first living creatures that heard that "O venerable men" were the brook trout of the Mashpee River. He was down there fishing for brook trout in the Mashpee River, and he was thinking about his speeches down there. But he was a great fisherman. He actually succumbed to injuries sustained when he was driving south to Kingston from his home in Marshfield, and his carriage overturned, and supposedly he died later of those injuries. He was on his way to fish for trout when he got injured. Another early records of what the resource was like in the early 1800s was a diary of a man called Dr. Jerome V.C. Smith. He was the mayor of Boston, and he was also a medical doctor. He developed an interest in fish when he was out at Rainsford Island. J.V.C. Smith, appointed physician of this island, 1826. Another one of my interests is the Boston Harbor Islands, and I happened to be out there on Rainsford Island, and I saw this inscription and immediately connected it. So that's how he got his interest in fish. He wrote a book called The Natural History of the Fishes of Massachusetts, which to the later ichthyologists, they totally panned him. He basically took species from Europe and adapted the names. So he really didn't know a lot about fish. But one of the most interesting things was the thing about trout fishing on Cape Cod that's at the back of the book. And he talked about fishing in the Childs River, catching 70 fine sea trout from the Childs River. In the Quashnet River, sea trout are collected in considerable numbers. But the most important thing he said, he talked about just about every various places where the sea trout are found are almost innumerable. Almost every little stream going down in the salt water contains sea-run brook trout. But brook trout have been heavily impacted, as you all know, by man's activities here in Massachusetts. There's been many, many dams built. Overfishing was a huge problem, as well as the construction of cranberry bogs and other modifications of these streams. In addition to all the road crossings, connections to warm water ponds, where they basically opened up connections to ponds to these groundwater fed rivers, and then introduced species like the bass and brown trout, things like that. So there's been a lot of impacts to brook trout. And nowadays our coastal populations of brook trout are very limited. If you can see in eastern Mass, the streams that have wild brook trout, known wild brook trout, are in red. In western Mass, brook trout are a dime a dozen. Here in eastern Massachusetts, they're very scarce. They've been greatly reduced in abundance compared to their former distributions. And one of the big reasons for this is all about the dams. This is a map of all the dams in Massachusetts. And this doesn't even indicate all the smaller dams, like basically the road culverts from mini dams or cranberry bog flumes, that sort of thing. So Massachusetts has been heavily dammed, and that's greatly modified our brook trout habitats. And one of the reasons that, that my agency, the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, was formed was because of the decline of the fisheries. We started as an agency in 1866. And basically, a man named Theodore Lyman was charged with improving the fisheries. But even before that, the fisheries have been depleted, and some of the first experiments on fish culture were conducted down in Sandwich by a guy named Captain Atwood. And this was actually a sea-run brook trout stream. We're looking at the dam for Sham Pond in Sandwich, and in 1856 there was still a population of wild trout that were found in these ponds. There's no longer trout found there, but originally this was probably a sea-run brook trout stream. That early experiment failed, but we still have the Sandwich Hatchery today, which has been in operation for over 100 years. After the Civil War, the Massachusetts Commission on Fisheries was formed. The first commissioner was a man named Theodore Lyman III. He came down, he was looking at all these coastal streams for the decline of the herring and the decline of the trout, and he met a man named Samuel Tisdale, and he later established the first state trout hatchery on land of Tisdale in the town of Wareham. And while he was down there, Samuel Tisdale introduced him to Red Brook. And one of the things that's unique about Red Brook is this journal dating back to the 1870s, where the Lyman family noted their catches every time they went down there. And so he started it as a journal of the Maple Springs Hatching House, and then he continued it as the Journal of Red Brook. And I've actually seen this actual handwritten manuscript. It was one of his great-grandsons had it. But Samuel Tisdale was the man that introduced Theodore Lyman to Red Brook. Samuel Tisdale should be famous in Massachusetts fisheries history because he's the man that brought smallmouth bass from New York and introduced them to Massachusetts in 1850. He brought them in on railroad cans from Saratoga Lake, and he stocked them in his little pond in the town of Wareham, and then spread them throughout Plymouth County from there. But it's interesting to note that Samuel Tisdale and Daniel Webster, this is actually something that Jeff Day, I guess, purchased, this ambrotype here.
The internet brought it to me.
What's that?
The internet brought it to me.
The internet, right. But the interesting thing is on the back of this, it indicated that Daniel Webster and Samuel Tisdale had the rights to fish Red Brook for many years. And so people used to actually purchase the rights to fish for trout on specific rivers. So Theodore Lyman was introduced to Red Brook around 1870. He started buying property up along Red Brook. And his family protected Red Brook and increased their land holdings for 6 generations until about the year 2000. So many, many generations of Lymans loved Red Brook and protected that land. And that's the key to why we'll be talking about Red Brook later on, was the Lyman family protecting the land. Theodore Lyman was very interested in sea-run trout. This was the report from 1869. It was actually written by Theodore Lyman. And he talks about the growth of sea-growing trout, where they transplanted fish from the Quashnet River to the Mashpee River, and how much they grew. And we're going to be talking a little bit later about some of the things that we do in modern times. But there's really nothing new under the sun. A lot of times people have been doing stuff for many, many years. And if you notice here, he talked about the information on the Mashpee trout from a man named G.L. Fessenden. And if you saw the slide about Daniel Webster, it was Fessenden's Tavern that Daniel Webster stayed at, and now that's known as Daniel Webster Inn down on Cape Cod. By the 1950s, though, the sea run brook trout population were basically just a memory. And a guy named John Reither, who was a scientist down at Woods Hole, came up with the idea that if we overstock these streams, they would force more trout to go out to the ocean where the food resources are better and increase the sea run brook trout population. Well, that didn't work out too well. They didn't see any great increase of sea run brook trout. But John Reither in 1997 authored a publication that was paid for by Trout Unlimited about anadromous brook trout. And that's actually one of the real starts of interest in sea run brook trout management here in Massachusetts, was this publication in '97. And one of the things that he found was, they did get some movement between the streams. And the streams I'll talk about, the Santuit, there was Quaker Run, the Mashpee River, the Quashnet River, the Childs River. They all feed down into Vineyard Sound. And so they heavily stocked these streams, and they did notice some movement between the streams. And one of the things that came out of this study was actually the first purchase of land to protect sea run brook trout specifically. After some hurricanes washed out the cranberry bog flumes on the Quashnet River in the 50s, the then Division of Fisheries and Game purchased these old bogs in 1956 to help protect the sea run brook trout of the Quashnet River. So this was actually one of the first purchases of property to protect sea run brook trout by the division. But by the 1960s and 1970s, people had basically given up on the brook trout. They said the rivers were too warm, they're never going to be able to reproduce in numbers, and they basically gave up on the brook trout and started heavily stocking these streams with brown trout to produce a sea run brown trout fishery. So almost all the streams that I'll talk about today were stocked heavily with brown trout, including Red Brook, which was privately stocked. Around 1975, as part of this sea run brown trout program, biologist Joe Bergen got in touch with the members of the Trout Unlimited, and they decided to improve the habitat on the Quashnet River, because by that time it had all overgrown with sweet gale and there wasn't much of a river left. So Fran Smith and other members of Trout Unlimited started building these deflectors and overhead covers to improve the habitat for the brown trout as well as the brook trout. Fran always had it in his mind that it was going to be the sea run brook trout that he wanted to restore in this river. As part of the sea run brown trout program, they used to go in the late fall during the spawning season and try to collect brown trout to create a specific strain of brown trout that they would breed at the Sandwich Hatchery. And this is some data. Basically, they've been electrofishing the same areas in the Quashnet River for many years. And I started around 1990, and one of the things that they told me is you needed to stock 5,000 brown trout in these little tiny rivers. And I looked at my allocation, I said, that's a lot of brown trout to be stocking in these tiny rivers to produce a fishery for the sea run brown trout. And so we started electrofishing, and I noticed there was still brook trout in there. And along with Ken Simmons, we basically decided to stop the stocking of brown trout in these sea run brook trout streams. We stopped stocking in the Santuit, then the Mashpee, then the Quashnet around '93. And one thing you'll notice is once we stopped stocking, the brown trout died off. Even though there had been some wild brown trout stock reproduction when we had stocked, once we stopped stocking, they basically died out. And it was the wild brook trout that actually started to increase in numbers. So this was one of the big things, I believe, that helped the brook trout population to increase, was stopping the brown trout stocking. And here's just an indication of the annual sampling we do every year, the same section between sections 1 and 4. It's the upper part of the lower Quashnet. And you can see this is the catch rate in that same section over time. And basically the population has been steadily increasing. It seems like it goes up and down occasionally from year to year, but in general the trend is upward. And one of the things that people always thought is, are these fish in this river just like Sandwich Hatchery fish that were basically there from the stockings in the 50s? Well, a guy named Brendan Annette came out from the West Coast. He was interested in steelhead. He looked at the DNA of these fish and found that they were distinctly different from the Sandwich Hatchery and in fact different from each other. And the streams that he studied were the Santuit, the Quashnet, and Red Brook. And so we found that they were genetically unique, and this finally got published in 2012. It was actually based on work done in 2003. Around this period of time, technology really started to develop, and we have these things called passive integrated transponders now. There are these little tags. Here's a comparison to a dime. They're about the size of a grain of rice, and the price has been dropping steadily over the years. They're now about $2 a piece. And this allows us to get a unique identification on individual fish. So we basically inject these tags into the abdomen of the brook trout, and here you can see a tag. It kind of gets mixed in with the internal organs of the trout, and that gives us a unique identification on each fish. That incision heals up within a week or two, and will stay with the fish until sometimes they come out with the female and the spawning. But one of the things that we wanted to find out is when these fish drop down into the salt water. So Brendan was able to get some money. He got some techniques from the Conti Anatomist Fish Lab. The Conti Lab built the antennas, and Fran Smith and Brendan and I and the people from the Conti Lab installed the antennas underneath Route 28 in 2007. There was an intern there named Andrew Tweel that started doing the monitoring. Since that time, Andrew moved on, and I've taken over the project, and now from these 2 antennas, now we have 3 streams going and 7 antennas. And so to give you an idea of how this works, the fish with the tag swims through the antenna, it beeps out a tag number, and it records on these readers here. So it gives me the tag number, the date, and the time that the fish went through. And this is a picture of an antenna at Red Brook. On the Childs and Quashnet rivers, we have the original antenna. Right now I only have one. They were so close together, it really didn't give me a good indication of direction, so I decided to move them out in the scattered locations. We have 3 antennas going on the Quashnet now, and we have one on the Childs River. And with help of the Sea Run Brook Trout Coalition, we now have solar panels on it, which makes my life a lot easier, because I was lugging 2 deep cycle batteries for each antenna every week, which gets old very quickly. And to give you an idea of some of the data that we're getting, basically this is the monthly movements, tag detections at Red Brook. You can see the peak of the movement is in the spawning time, October and November. They don't move around a lot at other times of the year, but in November they're seeking out these areas in order to spawn. And I'll talk about why these areas are so particular a little bit later. But they're seeking out these small, unique areas, and so they do a lot of movement up and down the river during the spawning season. This isn't an ink blot test, but this is a depiction of the tag detections with time, or date down here, and time on the vertical axis. And this is basically about 5 years worth of data. We have placed these antennas November 2008, and you can see these lines here basically correspond to November. The other interesting thing, so here's the peak time in November, but if you notice these little crescents, that's actually sunrise and sunset. So here's at sunrise they move a lot, and at sunset they move a lot. So this is pretty unique, where you can actually throw out some data and be able to see trends visually like that, instead of having to do a lot of statistical analysis. And here's another example of the same data, just presented a little bit different way. You can see a lot of these peaks, 6 o'clock in the morning, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. They're moving at sunrise and sunset. They don't move a lot during the middle of the day. And there's a reason for that in these streams that they've adapted to. Another thing that we can get from this data is growth rates, recaptures. So we can recapture these fish. This was one of the largest recaptured brook trout that we caught in the Quashnet River. It was about 14 inches long, which is a pretty big wild brook trout. And the interesting thing about this fish is it only went down to the salt water for a couple of days in July. So here is a 14-inch fish. So that kind of threw out the old notion that fish that was 12 inches long or longer in these streams had to be a sea run brook trout. The thing is about these streams, they don't have to go down to salt water. Oftentimes the salt water comes to them with the young of year eels coming up, the glass eels, and then the young of year herring coming down in the fall. So a fish can get pretty big in these streams without actually going into the tide water. I mentioned they move a lot in November to find these specific areas. In the Squanatissit River, there's certain areas that they go to, and it's basically where the stream hits against the sandy bank and it intersects with the groundwater. So there's certain areas that year after year you can go out to and find brook trout in, and there's a specific reason for that. It's basically the upwelling areas where it comes in next to these mineral banks, it's rich in oxygen. We've been working with the U.S. Geological Survey on the Squanatissit River for a while. They've had 2 big training courses where the top investigators and surface groundwater interactions have been down there. And one of the things that they're finding is that groundwater where these fish are spawning is very different from the groundwater in the middle of the stream. In the middle of the stream, the groundwater has to go through the peat, and it gets the oxygen gets used up. So even though it's cold in the middle of the river, it's very poor in oxygen. So these fish know where to go to lay their eggs to have the best success. If this works. This is a little video I took in November 2015 at that site that I talked about near that bank. And you can see these fish, they basically key in on very specific areas. And this is about the only time when you can see large concentrations of fish in specific areas. And they basically just hover over these areas, and this is an area of upwelling groundwater. You see the female was doing a little digging there with her tail. She's trying to create a little pocket in order to lay the eggs. And you can see she's keyed in on very specific areas, and she's just hovering in that one little area. And what she's doing is actually increasing that groundwater flow to the redds to make her eggs have a greater survival rate. You saw a little nip there? She's basically defending that territory, trying to get rid of that other brook trout that was a little bit closer. I had a series of interns over the years and had one, Jen Salas, help me put that together and edit it. So other people got interested in restoring brook trout. Members of the Falmouth Rod and Gun Club came to me and they wanted to see if they could do something to improve the brook trout in the Childs River. In 2006, we went in there. We basically found 1 adult brook trout. There was no wild brook trout population there in 2006. And I talked about before, in the 1800s, how there was over 70 trout a guy caught in 1 day from this river. 2006, there was no brook trout there. So all of these things came together, the pit tagging, the increase of the population of the Squanatissit River, and that allowed us basically to take some of the fish from the Squanatissit River and put them into the Childs River. And we did that for 3 years. The first year we put in 19 trout, the second year 29, and then in 2010, 37. So basically all those fish could be contained in one cooler. We put them into the Childs River, we pit tagged them before we put them in, and then we monitored them. We put them in June, and we followed up in September. And by 2011, these are some of the fish that can be found in the Childs River. Basically, we had reproduction every year that we put them in. 2016, I expect we have reproduction in 2017, but I haven't been out to check, but I expect that they reproduced again. So basically, they're on their own now. It was 3 years of introductions, and they've been on their own ever since.
Steve, is that the picture in the bottom right in the previous slide?
Let's see.
It looks like a tiger trout almost, one of your hybrids.
Right, now that's just the brook trout. These are the underwater, I had an underwater camera so you can really see the patterns. And that's one thing, if I had more time, I bet you could recognize individual fish by the patterns on their back. Because it's pretty distinctive. If you look at the little patterns, each fish is a little bit different. And I bet if you had the time and the proper underwater camera, you could basically recognize individual fish. But these are pure strain brook trout. One of the things that has been impacting the Childs River restoration is otters. We have found pit tags in next to an area called an otter toilet. It's an area where there's fish bones and scales. We found pit tags in these otter toilets. So this is probably the last thing a lot of the brook trout in the Childs River see is the mouth of an otter. Some interesting things have come up with the antennas. In February, I had 2 young year fish from the Childs River showed up in the middle of the Squanatissit River during the middle of the day in February. So I thought, that's unusual. And I looked back, they didn't go out the Childs River antenna, they didn't come up the Squanatissit River antenna. And there was 2 fish within 1 second of each other. And so my theory is they were in the belly of an otter, and it came overland from the child who quashed it and happened to go through the antenna. I mentioned Red Brook, the Lyman family basically protecting it until 2001. Well,